66.
6640.
Your future lies in 6640.
66 books by 40 authors, and yet we now discover it's an integrated message system from outside our time domain.
Welcome to 6640, Chuck Missler's daily program connecting the Bible to your life and the world around you. It's God's plan that began before time, and it's your future. It's a plan that includes you. Now here's the host of 6640, John Leffler.
The Mysteries of the Planet Mars is the new series we're starting right here on 6640. You know, Chuck, it's interesting. Astronomy was my hobby, and it's very easy for me to point out, like, I'll go, well, there's Venus, and then there is Saturn, and there's Jupiter and Mars, and you can do. People look at you, well, how do you know that? How do you tell that's a planet and this isn't a star, and why is it there? You know?
Right. Well, of course, they were called planets because they were wanderers. They didn't move in a normal sidereal fashion. But you know, it's interesting. You can do that, John, and we both can, because we had astronomy as a hobby. But I would say, what, less than a few in 100 really are that interested in an ephemeris or the movement of these bodies enough to be able to distinguish them from others. Sure. And one of the interesting things to contemplate here is the ancient cultures, as we read, you know, the ancient pagan cultures, were terrified of the planet Mars, not just planets in general. That's why the word martial arts is in our vocabulary. That's why Mars was the god of war. Why? Why were these ancient cultures, who had less, you know, sophistication than we have, less interest in space, and you know, we think of mass.
Why were they obsessed by it?
They were obsessed. They, in fact, really terrified. They had priesthoods. They had whole rites that were organized. And one of the reasons we discover is, apparently, there's evidence that the planet Mars interfered in their lives on a periodic basis, so much so as to destroy cities and so forth, and that the orbital relationships, we've learned a lot about orbital harmonics, that the orbits of Earth and Mars intersected and had energy transfers that are recorded through history and account for catastrophes through history. In fact, affected the calendar, because the ancient calendars were tied to either October or March, which was the near pass-by periods every 104 years. Well, the point is that all of this starts to give us a whole different picture of the ancient cultures. And so we're going to get into the mysteries of the planet Mars, not only its orbital situations, but its impact on cultures. And some of this background may be helpful to our understanding some things that are in the Scripture, namely Joshua chapter 10, the so-called long day. What on earth is that all about? And this will also give us a background for these press releases we hear from NASA, where they've discovered life on some rock in Antarctica. What's that got to do with Mars? And is there life in the outer space? All this thing is being fed rather aggressively by our space agencies and so forth to help promote a number of different issues. We're going to explore that, because I think it's essential for the biblical students.
As we start the new series, The Mysteries of the Planet Mars.
We'll devote some time to exploring a little bit the planet Mars, both what we know astronomically, also the significance of a number of startling discoveries, also what impact this may have on each of us as we work diligently to try to understand the Scriptures better. How do all these things fit together? And so I'd like to take the most important things first, but that probably won't work, because everyone in here will be wondering, you know, what about the recent press releases? So we will be getting at that relatively early in this two-part exploration. Now, the planet Mars, as you all, I'm sure, are aware, is the fourth major planet from the Sun. It's about half again as far from the Sun as we are. It is named after the Roman god of war. And many people will naturally presume that that's just a question of a cultural tradition, that just as the ancients named a lot of things after a lot of their various superstitions and things, it's very possible, as we learn more about the history on the planet Earth of the antics of this peculiar planet, that we may come to the possibility that it was named very appropriately. You see, the strange thing about the planets in general, and the planet Mars in particular, is that it captured not just the imaginations of the ancient cultures, but gripped them with fear. Most of the early civilizations turn out, if you do your homework, you discover, were terrified of the planet Mars. Now, at first you figure, well, those are just superstitious civilizations. Those are people that for a variety of reasons, were afraid of everything. And these strange wanderers, that's what the word planet originally meant. Most of the stars, as you know, move in relatively prescribed, or appear to move rather steadily, because their movements are obviously the rotation caused by the rotation of the Earth. So they move in their particular paths very predictably. But there are a group of objects in the sky that move rather strangely, because they'll move along like a star for a while, but then they strangely appear to go backwards for a little while and then forward again. And this is why they were named the Wanderers, in effect. But the most dominant one, as you start studying this, at least in a cultural sense, is the planet Mars. Now, we know today, of course, that apparent motion is caused by the fact that they are on elliptical orbits around the sun just like we are. And when you start comparing those motions, that gives rise to this peculiar path that they described in the sky. But the observation that I'd like you to think about a little bit is the ancient cultures were terrified of the planet Mars. They worshipped it. The planet Mars is known as Baal in the Old Testament, and the priests of Baal. Now, the word Baal actually just means Lord, or it's a title in a sense. But you'll discover, if you do your scriptural homework, that God speaks frequently of the hosts of the heavens, referring to these things, not to worship these things. The priests of Baal had their particular altars and such on the high ground. Often you'll see in the scriptures that the idol worship was in the high places. You'll see the scriptures speak of groves. Now, the primary application of the groves were in effect phallic symbols, the gods or goddesses of fertility, if you will. There are some scholars that suspect possibly some of those groves may have been wooden examples of Stonehenge on the Salisbury Plain in England. There's a monument quite famous as being one of the oldest monuments that's known on the planet Earth. Many scholars for centuries recognized that its architecture is lined up with the midsummer sunrise. But Gerald Hawkins made history by his book and the CBS special and the rest, where he apparently uncovered the fact that the Stonehenge lines up with not just the midsummer sunrise, but all the key positions of the sun and the moon. In fact, after he published his original papers and created a huge controversy, through a writing from a friend in South Africa, he made a further discovery that the mysterious Aubrey holes that surround Stonehenge also allow that structure to predict eclipses. Now, archaeologically, we know that structure was built over a 300-year period, strangely enough, and then abandoned. And when you do a mathematical analysis of its ability to predict eclipses, you discover that it predicts eclipses quite accurately, but it makes an error once every 300 years. And so you can only guess at the embarrassment of the priesthood that was in charge when it failed to perform as appropriate, and one can only guess as to what the circumstances were. The archaeological studies of Stonehenge, incidentally, also demonstrate that there was international trade with the British Isles in that Wessex period, which is about 1500 BC. And so the possibility that Britannia was, in fact, the source of tin that caused it to be called Tarshish in the Middle East is it's still a conjecture, but possibly a very plausible one. But in any case, the main point is the ancient cultures were very, very concerned with the planetary movements. Now, for them to be concerned about the year going by in seasons is understandable, because that determined their agricultural success. And so there's much to do with trying to develop correct calendars. But as we start studying calendars, you discover something else that's rather strange. If you look at 14 different ancient calendars, the ancient Egyptian, the Assyrian, the Babylonian, the Hebrew, and the Etruscan, and you can go through a list of 14 of the ancient calendars, you notice something rather interesting about them all. While they had their differences, they all presumed a 360-day year on the planet Earth. And they apparently worked fine up until about 701 BC. In 701 BC, most of the calendars were revised, changed. The Romans added a few days, moving towards what we now know as our 365 and a quarter day annual calendar, to get the solar calendar in step with the sidereal calendar. The Hebrews did a strange thing. They added a month every few years on a very strange formula. Now you can find the rabbinical literature full of speculations. Why did King Hezekiah choose to that peculiar way of reconciling their solar year to the sidereal year? What no one writes about is why did they have to change it at all? What happened in 701 BC? It turns out one of the possibilities is that this was all due, strangely enough, to the planet Mars. So there's all kinds of mysteries associated with the planet Mars, and we're going to explore some of those, particularly ones that would impact us